He walked through the city like a ghost. Heavy footsteps, head down, eyes an empty. The rain poured as if the sky itself was grieving, but no one noticed him. To the world, he was invisible, just another broken man, drifting toward the edge. His name was Daniel, and tonight, he planned to end his life. He stood at the edge of a bridge, his shoes soaked, his soul numb. One deep breath, one last look, and then nothing. But just as he leaned forward, a soft, childlike voice echoed behind him. "Mister, does Jesus still live in your heart?" The words didn't come with thunder. They came with warmth. They weren't loud, but they shattered him. He froze, and when he turned around, there was no one there. Before the pain, before the silence, before the rain, there was light. Daniel Carter was once a man full of life. He owned a small design firm, worked hard, and loved harder. But none of it mattered more than his family. Eleanor, his wife, was the calm in his chaos. And Mia, their daughter, she was magic. 7 years old, full of sparkle, always asking impossible questions and offering unstoppable hugs. There's a memory he plays over and over in his mind. It was a Sunday morning. Daniel was teaching Mia to ride her bike in the park. She fell, scraped her knee, started crying. And then, between sniffles, she looked up at him and asked, "Daddy, will you still teach me to fly someday?" He knelt beside her, wiped her tears and said, "Yes, my love, I'll teach you to fly, even when your wings forget how." That was Daniel, the man who built castles of love for his 2 girls. And then, one phone call, one crash, one moment that shattered time. A drunk driver ran a red light. Eleanor died instantly. Mia was in the hospital for 6 days. She never opened her eyes again. Daniel didn't cry at the funeral. He didn't scream. He simply stopped being. The world continued. But he stayed frozen in that hospital hallway, even if his body kept moving. Grief for some is quiet. For Daniel, it became a storm. At first, he tried to survive. He went back to work. He answered condolences, but every "I'm so sorry" felt like sandpaper against his soul. Every morning he woke up was a betrayal. Because they didn't. He stopped going to work, stopped answering calls, stopped speaking. His home, once filled with laughter and bedtime stories, became a museum of ghosts. He couldn't enter Mia's room without collapsing, so he locked it. And then he locked himself. Days bled into nights. He slept on the floor, didn't shave, didn't eat, just existed. And then came the anger. Anger at the driver, at the system that let him walk free after posting bail, at God for allowing this, at himself and for not being the one who died. He started following the man, the one who killed his family. He learned his address, his routines, even the time he picked up his son from school. Daniel bought a gun. He didn't even feel fear when holding it, only emptiness. He wasn't planning revenge. He was planning an ending, not just for the man, but for himself. Because if life could take Elena and Mia, then what was the point of Daniel? It was a Friday night. The city lights flickered through the fog. Daniel tucked the gun into his coat pocket. He didn't write a note, didn't lock the door, because no one was left to read it, and no one would care it was open. He walked the streets in silence, every face blurred, every sound distant. He wasn't part of this world anymore, just a shadow passing through it. He reached the apartment building. The man's car was parked out front. Daniel stood across the street, watching the window light flicker. He imagined the man laughing, holding his son. The son that still had a father. The son that still had a bedtime story. Daniel's hand tightened around the grip of the gun. He started crossing the street. One step, then another. But halfway across, something small tugged at his sleeve. He stopped, looked down, and there she was, a little girl, about the same age Mia would have been. She wasn't crying, she wasn't scared. She just looked up at him, eyes wide and impossibly still, and asked, "Mister, does Jesus still live in your heart?" The city went silent, like the whole world was holding its breath. Daniel froze. His knees buckled. He dropped the gun, and then he dropped to the ground. He wept. For the first time since the funeral, he wept like a child. But when he looked up again, the little girl was gone. Daniel sat there on the cold pavement, drenched in rain and tears, shaking like a leaf in a storm. For minutes or maybe hours he didn't move, because something inside him had cracked open, not broken, opened. That one sentence, "Does Jesus still live in your heart?" echoed louder than all the silence of the past year. He stood up slowly, his hands empty now. The weight of the gun, gone. The weight of rage, starting to dissolve. He looked around, trying to find the girl, but the street was empty. The world had returned to its rhythm. He asked a passing couple if they'd seen her. They hadn't. He wandered through the nearby blocks, searching, asking, describing, but no one had seen any child. The next day he went back to the same street, and the next, and the next. Every day for a week, same time, same place. Nothing. Until finally an old woman sitting on a bench nearby whispered to him, "I've lived here 15 years. There are no children who match what you're describing. Are you sure she was real?" Daniel said nothing, but deep down, he knew. He went home that night and opened Mia's room for the first time in months. And there, sitting on her bed, was the exact same dress the girl on the street had been wearing. The same color, same pattern, same small embroidered angel on the collar. His breath caught in his throat. He knelt beside the bed, held the tiny dress close, and whispered through the tears, "I'm sorry. I forgot who I was. I forgot who you were. But I remember now." That night marked the beginning of Daniel's return. He didn't suddenly become whole. Grief doesn't vanish. It transforms. But for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something stir within him. Hope. He turned himself in the next day, told the police everything, about the gun, the plan, the pain. They were stunned. But because he hadn't hurt anyone, and because of his clean record, he was placed under mandatory therapy and community service. That's where the healing began. Part of his sentence was to volunteer at a shelter for orphaned children. At first, he barely spoke. He swept floors, served meals, fixed broken chairs. But the children, they had a way of pulling him in. One girl asked him to read her a bedtime story. Another handed him a crayon drawing that said, "You're my hero." A little boy climbed into his lap without saying a word. Piece by piece, their love rebuilt what the world had shattered. He started sharing his story, slowly, carefully, with teenagers who felt forgotten. And they listened, because Daniel didn't preach. He understood. A year later, he founded a center of his own, the Mia Foundation, a place where lost children could feel found, where pain met purpose, where broken hearts learned how to beat again. And over the door, carved into the wood, were the same words that saved him. "Does Jesus still live in your heart?" Years passed. The center grew. What started as a small shelter became a movement, helping children not just in his city, but in places Daniel had never even imagined he'd reach again. He published a book, not for fame, but because the story refused to stay silent. The Girl Who Saved My Soul became a lifeline for others walking through the dark. Letters poured in from people who were standing at the same edge he once stood on. And Daniel answered every single one, not with advice but with truth. You are not forgotten. Even when you scream into the night and no one answers, heaven is still listening. He was invited to speak at churches, recovery centers, even prisons, not as a preacher, but as a man who had bled, eaten, and survived. One evening, after a long day of mentoring at the foundation, Daniel walked into Mia's old room, now preserved just as it was. He sat by the window, closed his eyes, and whispered, "I kept my promise, baby. I taught others to fly, even when their wings were broken." He felt the breeze, soft, warm, almost like small arms wrapping around him, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled without pain behind it, because he knew he hadn't just survived, he had become someone else's miracle. So if you've lost something so deep it feels like your soul went with it, if the silence is louder than your prayers, if you're standing on that edge, maybe this story is your little girl in the rain, maybe this voice is the question meant to stop you. Does Jesus still live in your heart? Because even in your darkest moment, he never left.